Okay. Hi, Rita.
All right, done.
Hello.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good. Okay.
So George, you're going to kick off, and I'm going to put my 2 cents worth in from time to time. That's how I understand it.
Okay. That sounds good.
Is everyone
Okay.
seeing the slides? Can I just double check that that's worked?
Can people see the slides?
They were
No.
temporarily up,
can't.
but they popped off again. But they were up for
Okay.
a second there, Chris.
Yeah.
So I think when you hit record, that they disappeared.
Yeah, no worries.
So
Give me a sec.
okay.
Yeah.
Sounds good. Okay. All right. You get to slide number 2 then. Okay. So the it's a point of figuring out the secondary structure is to help us find out if there are coarse constructs that will give us a deeper understanding of schemas. And, that was Jeff's initial intention around the 5-domain model, to try to get a sort of grasp of basic themes. And one of the things he pointed to in that as well was the family environment. And so each one was associated with a particular quality, particular sort of sense of what the family tone was like that would lead to a certain class of schemas. So that's another question then. Is there certain broad family themes that help us understand certain clusters of schemas in a broader brushstroke sort of way? Another thing that is important around the domain level is that a lot of other theories are articulated on that level. So with the attachment theory, it's more broader brushstroke. With Deci and Ryan, it's more at what we consider the secondary domain level. And Dweck's model, which we'll touch on a little bit later, also is a broader brushstroke approach. And the schemas are wonderful for us as clinicians because they go into a lot of fine-grained detail that are relevant in terms of how we can empathize and really intervene. But the broader brushstroke level is important theoretically, particularly if we want to look at how we fit into the broader landscape of theories. The other thing I think is important about the domain level is that if we're looking for significant correlations, if we want to do studies and we want to compare our model to other models in terms of these constructs, and even within our own model, if we want to look at parenting patterns as it relate to schemas, we're more likely to come up with significant correlations at the domain level, and less likely to find those at the specific schema level. So that's another point of relevance for us. I think a fourth is case conceptualization. There's a lot of detail that we go into in terms of specific schemas and modes and how things interplay, and being able to encompass that within a framework of major domains can be helpful in terms of organizing. Is it basically around connection? Is it basically around an issue of autonomy, or is it some blending, equal blending of those two, or is it limit setting, and how do those come into play? So I think that it can help to organize and keep us in track in terms of the basic conceptualization of a case. And then in terms of intervention, I think that there's some surprising things that have come up around what we had assumed schemas to be in terms of their partners and how they would be connect with one another, and what the research has shown. And there's some surprising shifts in that. And I think that that has implications in terms of what does that mean? What is the function of the schema then? What is really going on there, and what are the clinical implications of that? So the next slide, Chris. So I think that the 5-domain model is still had quite a bit of attraction, and yet I think that it's misleading in some significant ways. And disconnection, the impaired autonomy domains are fine. That holds up across all the different studies, but the other directed domain does not hold up. And one of the issues is that other directedness applies to the disconnection domain as much as it applies to the impaired autonomy domain, as much as applies to the excessive responsibility and standards domain. So it's really something that cuts across domains, and it's not a core concept as a result. And that's what we're looking for. What are core constructs rather than facets of different.
Add in
Go
there, George, that particular thing is not a core concept, and there's never been any evidence to support it. So kind of like, whilst it looks logically that those couple of schemas would be together and they're somehow separate, it's never had any support at all in statistically.
Right. You know, that's really good, because I think that if you look at subjugation and other self-sacrifice, it's compelling. And to say, oh yeah, that's right, and approval. It's about other directedness. And so it, as a theory, it captures us. But if we look at the empirical evidence, it doesn't hold up. And so it really points us that what we think is going on is not always what is going on. Sometimes it is, like disconnection or the autonomy issues. We've got it right, but certainly not here. Similarly, with overvigilance and inhibition, that it's as important an aspect of the disconnection domain and as of the excessive responsibility and standards domain, and also has a lot to do with the impaired autonomy domain. So again, it's not a core concept, overvigilance and inhibition. It's a facet of a lot of different schemas. And it's misleading then to think of that as a general theme to organize our thinking around and our work around. So the shift in our thinking about the domains happened in 2011, heading into 2012, when I began to work with Paul Paris on a chapter entitled "A New Look at Core Emotional Needs." And at that point, Jeff was thinking that we had the 5 domains, and we were working on that premise. And as I began to look at the different studies and put together a table looking at the trends and what was coming up in terms of the secondary structure, the four categories began to emerge quite clearly. There might be 1 or 2 studies that didn't hold up, but then that led to our shift to thinking that it's not 5, it's 4, and that the 4 are different in terms of the nature of what, at least the last 2 are different from what we had assumed them to be. And this was articulated more formally in the article that Bach and Jeff and I did, and in which we stated that we had shifted from the 5 to the 4 in what we call cluster models. And cluster is, I think the idea there was, it was not quite as formal as a theory, but it was more statistical. It was trends in the studies, not statistically verified. I think it's becoming closer to being statistically verified now. After enough studies have gravitated towards a 4 domain model. But this is now fairly established, and now I think it's working its way into the theory in terms of how do we make sense of that conceptually. Okay. Now there's some new understandings then that we have on schemas when it comes to how they cluster. And I think that the one of the ones that stands out for me is the emotional inhibition schema. That was thought of as something entirely different from the disconnection rejection domain. And again and again, it's come back to that as a central aspect of that domain. So that's interesting. So it's something other than the way it was described as part of that domain was a focus on the inhibition of feelings and impulses as a result of parents who are grim, demanding, focused on avoiding mistakes more than the pursuit of dreams and wishes is a basic thrust of it that Jeff articulated. So the child was taught to inhibit their spontaneous self-expression. So the new placement suggests something different. It's not a grim environment that teaches a child to inhibit themselves and it's modeled by parents. It's something that's going on in relation to connection, pain around connection, and the fear of being abused, the fear of being deprived, of being judged, and that and this looks more like a variant of the detached protector mode. And if we look at the detached protector phenomena as on a continuum, a spectrum, that it's not as flagrant as it would be with the numbing and blocking out, as in with the borderline personality disorder, but it's a blocking out of feelings. It's a disconnect from inner experience and a disconnect from free interaction with other people. That's a protection against emotional pain. So I think it's something different going on with that. And I think it has clinical implications, and it also has implications in terms of how we're going to construct the inventory. And I'll talk about that later. There's some other schemas that hop around from one study to the other. I'm referring to them as shape shifters here, abandonment, for example. Sometimes with the disconnection domain, sometimes with the impaired autonomy domain. So it suggests that there are different fears that are connected with abandonment. The fear of not being able to handle day-to-day life, and so that you need someone there because you can't count on your own functioning. And the other fear is more having to do with the other's unreliability, not being available. So one is more self-oriented and the other is more other-oriented.
Just want to chime in there that abandonment turned out, although it kind of like has that, if I go back one level, one is that what's very consistent across all of the data is the primary domain of disconnection and the primary domain of autonomy. So that those things kind of like hold up in theories and hold up anytime we look at the schema questionnaire. Abandonment explains actually a lot of variance when you look at levels of symptomatology. So it might be a particularly potent one, it appears. And it does impact both those kind of things, which is a little bit unusual, that it does have an influence on our sense of being able to connect with people in a stable and enduring way, and also on our capacity to be able to take care of ourselves and be safe as we go about the world.
Yeah, it's interesting. I hadn't thought about that in terms of the power of it and the pervasiveness of it, but that's a really good point, Chris. I like that. And it certainly fits in with attachment theory in terms of the whole focus around connection with significant other and the intense feelings that come up around that. Insufficient self-control has hopped around between the impaired limits domain and the impaired autonomy domain, which makes sense in terms of it can be a function of entitlement, more to do with self-centeredness and a lack of control out of that, or it can have to do with impulsivity and difficulties that come around impulse control. And so those are distinct sources or contributions or drivers of insufficient self-control. Punitiveness.
You want me to talk about that one?
Yeah, that's where you've made the important contributions, Chris. Yeah, you talk about that.
So if we talk about originally, when Jeff was thinking about punitiveness in clients, he thought that the punitiveness was something that you experience both towards yourself and towards other people. So when he wrote the items for the long form of the schema questionnaire, he had items to do with punitiveness towards self and punitiveness towards others. Now, a big change happens when it went to the short form, all of the punitiveness towards other people disappeared from the questionnaire. So sometimes it's when people talk about punitiveness, and if you've only used the short form to kind of like assess that, you'll be looking at a subset of maybe what punitiveness is actually about. And I know that debate comes up when we talk about modes as well, with the punitive parent mode. I've been at schema conferences where people have said, well, the punitive parent mode really applies to self, and other people will say it can apply to self or others. So in the research that we've done, punitiveness, when you assess it by the long form, you can have people that are punitive just towards themselves. So, like as in depression, for instance. Then you can get people that are only punitive towards other people. And you might get that in, say, I don't know, PTSD in the military, for instance, where people are really upset about those people that have done the wrong thing and kind of like let them down. And then you've also got patients who are going to have both punitiveness to self and others. So according to our research, all three are possible. So punitiveness to self and others might be in borderline things. So just to make it clearer for you, you can see in the next slide, these are the items from the long form. So the first few items on the punitive scale and the long forms are all punitiveness to other people. I hold grudges, you know, even when someone has apologized, I get upset. I get angry when people make excuses. That's all punitiveness towards others. And then these two kind of like down here are examples of punitiveness towards self. And the actual, in the long form, it's half-half between the two. In the short form, it's only these items that exist. Okay, so.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's great. It just it really highlights the value of your having gone back to the long form to do this study, Chris. It really helps us to get back to some basic fundamental elements of the schemas. So in looking at central tendencies of the secondary structure of the YSQ, there's two major findings. One is that there's a 5 to 18 schemas. There's a couple of studies that come up with this, and then one general factor. And I think, and the other is that there's 4 domains. I think that both of these are valuable ways to organize and look at what's going on. And if we look at the schemas as primary with one general factor, this is consistent with correlations with the 5-factor, the big 5, the personality trait model, where most of the schemas correlate with neuroticism. I think that the general factor, in my mind, is something more basic than neuroticism, and it has to do with sensitivity, emotional sensitivity, emotional reactivity. And that it's more like the orchid, dandelion, child dimension, where there are children who are more prone to react to adverse environments and then more prone to develop schemas in a more amplified form. And I think that they're more sensitive. They also can respond exceptionally well to nurturing environments. But I think that's what I see as the general factor. So the 4 domains, we're going to go on, Chris, to what we see, and I'm adding in here a couple of studies that haven't been included in the listing before, with the work with John Lewis and I don't think it was understood as looking at the 4 domains, but that was part of other research we were doing, but it was included within that. And that's also been confirmation of this disconnection domain. But the other thing that has been consistent is no matter who does it or what method of factor extraction they use, nobody can mistrusted abuse and emotional deprivation. That's there in all the studies. So that there's a pretty strong signals to come out in terms of something central to disconnection. Emotional inhibition is not in, I can't see with, I've got something blocking. Which study was that yours, Chris, where it didn't come out in the disconnection domain?
Yes, it's actually, that's quite, yeah, it didn't come out in disconnection in this one and this one. Yeah.
Okay.
It should actually be blank as well.
Oh, yeah. Okay. All right. Okay. So that's something which is pretty consistently there, but not always. So that's interesting. Defectiveness also is most of the time there in social isolation. So we're going to go on to the next one.
Yeah.
I'm going to add too that one of the things with the study I did with John Lewis, as far as methods of factor extraction, that there's variation in these studies, both in how the inventory is scored, whether it's there are items grouped or they're randomized, and the method of factor extraction, whether it's the Kaiser method and the the parallel analysis, which parallel analysis is a relatively more stringent test, and then which held up. So that's why I want to look at the one that I did with the John, because I think that adds to, in my mind, the strength of it. And also there was a multi-group confirmatory factor analysis. So we had both Asian and Western samples included in the mix, so that we're looking at universal structure.
It just underscores the point that these are reasonably stable findings, isn't it? Because it's pretty much independent, you know, of whatever the method of extraction that you use, what country you kind of like do it in. You all come up with this, you know, disconnection and autonomy as very stable factors, pretty much like loading on exactly the same schemas.
Right. And I think that we can say that, that's something that shows up in a lot of the models in terms of autonomy and connection. That's something we think about in terms of the attachment theory, and people have talked about a lot. One of the things that we're doing with schema therapy is that we're looking at those major groups, and we're also being able to look at different facets of that. So it's spelled out and articulated in a way that are not in other theories. So we're
I just add, even just from a schema point of view, back when it was talking about schemas with depression, we used to talk about there are two types of depression depending on the psychological kind of like role. So we'll talk about the people with identical symptoms of depression, like that they don't have pleasure for activities, that their libido's low, they don't sleep, that the underlying psychological thing will either be disconnection. So 2 years before they entered therapy, they split up with their partner and haven't been able to get over it. But you'll get exactly the same psychiatric kind of presentation as if 2 years ago, the person experienced a business failing, say that, they lost the family farm. So the symptoms will be exactly the same, but the psychological domain underneath is one is about issues of connection, the other is about issues of autonomy.
right, right. Yeah, and those are two major themes that he had talked about. And then we get to the third and fourth, which adds to some of the other models. So impaired limits is something that shows up quite consistently, and that's often, almost always paired with insufficient self-control. So that's a third clustering. And Chris is different. I want to say a couple things about, and Chris, you can go into yours more because we'll go into the next slide. But I see as central to what showed up in Chris, if you look at the factor loadings, the 0.8s and 0.7s were around entitlement and I think insufficient self-control. So the central tendency is in the same ballpark with other things added into it. You want to?
Yeah, I just want to also though emphasize that this one's important. The third factor, excessive responsibility standards, and that's extremely.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I did. Yeah.
Across
Okay.
the studies,
Right. No. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's kind of like sometimes it's kind of like an over socialized factor. So these people, if you score higher on this, have been during their upbringing, it's been really enforced to them that they should do right, so they try and work really hard and they try and make sure that they do the right thing by other people. So it's very strong. Of course, in psychopathology, you'd see that often like with people with like chronic depression are going to have so high scores on this factor. People with eating disorders end up with high scores on this factor. So pretty much anything that RODBT targets, that kind of like over control thing, is going to be reflected in this particular construct.
Yeah, I hopped right over that one. That's interesting. So yeah, that one is one that comes out quite clearly and strongly. Interestingly, I think that the disconnection and the impaired autonomy accounts for the vast majority of the variance within the YSQ. But this is an important, while smaller percent of variance, it's a very important subset of schemas and shows up very consistently. So where it begins to get a little, it's still pretty clear signal here with the fourth, the impaired limits domain. And this, like I had mentioned, insufficient control hops around between where it didn't show up in these places, it showed up in impaired autonomy.
Okay, so let me talk about, so, the thing on those first three is kind of like really clear. The only thing that's kind of like a little bit perhaps not so straightforward is what happens with this fourth factor. So this is a study published in the Australian Psychologist kind of like this year. And just before I show you kind of like what the fourth factor is, I want to point out that it is the only study out of all of these that has used the long form and all 18 schemas. So it's kind of used a slightly different questionnaire, and it has a different result for the fourth factor when you do that. And I'll just show, it's been called in the article, we called it an emotional dysregulation factor because it was high on entitlement punitiveness towards others, fear of losing in control. These were the kind of like schemas that come up here. So it's with reason we called it emotional dysregulation. If you look at Answer's book on borderline personality disorder, other than the disconnection thing, the next factors that are highlighted in that book as present in borderline personality disorder is entitlement, punitiveness, these kinds of things here. So that's why we gave it that name. Now, there are reasons about why this might exist and whether it's real or not. The first thing I want to point out is that if the short form doesn't have punitiveness towards others, you can't get it as a factor loading. So if you added those items towards punitive to others into the short form, you may in fact get this thing coming out because it's highly influenced by it. So that's one issue. The other is that our sample is 544 patients, but we had like 180 really had chaotic borderline type presentations. So if you have a lot of borderlines in your sample, you might actually influence the factor structure kind of at the end. That is another possibility. But what we think is other places need to do kind of see if they can replicate the results using the longer form in clinical samples with all 18 schemas. And then we'll see whether or not it's idiosyncratic or whether it really is something to consider. And the last thing that I would just kind of like say about it is that if you have used the long form and you've got entitlement, oh, that doesn't work when I point at the screen. If you've got entitlement and punitive to others and fear of loss of control, if you've got those coming up, then clinically, you can understand the presentation as this emotional dysregulation. If you only get elevation, say on entitlement and insufficient self-control, then clinically you might say, oh, the major issue is just impaired limits. So that's how I would then use the data. George, do you want to, we hadn't talked about this, but did you want to say anything about that? Did that make sense to you as well?
Let's see. I'm just getting rid of a screen here. Let me see. You're saying that adding the punitiveness towards other into entitlement and fear of losing control adds that other element you're saying.
That's right. So the items for fear of losing control are part of emotional ambition, but they don't come out. They're not on the short form again.
Yeah, right.
So it's kind of like, so one of the reasons you might just get this sort of like different clustering of the schemas is because you have a whole bunch of items that's picking up some variance in schema that isn't picked up by the short form.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, it really does look, as far as that clustering, the entitlement, punitive, other, fear of losing control, and self-control, it's really around anger. And if we're looking at BPD, the buildup of unmet needs and exploding, and that seems to, it's driving that, and the loss of self-control. So we have emotional constriction would be part of that. So it's that cycle, BPD cycle of detached protector, holding in, blocking things out, building and exploding.
Yes.
And then followed by punitive towards self, because it's just secondarily backed up, so we can see that coming in. So it's interesting. Yeah, I mean, it does fit with that as far as that whole dynamic. And what we're looking at there as to it's looking at as a distinct dimension other than the separate from the disconnection.
Yeah.
Where the deprivation is being built up around that, and then it comes out in this other dimension.
Indeed.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. That's very interesting. Yeah. Good.
Okay. Back to you, I think, George.
Okay. Looking at central tendencies again, that with disconnection and impaired autonomy, those are our two biggies. And then no matter who's doing the work, they can't miss mistrust, abuse, and emotional deprivation. Those show up over and over again. Failure can't be missed in impaired autonomy. And excessive responsibility and standards over socialization shows up again and again. We have impaired limits with insufficient self-control, entitlement, insufficient self-control, or this emotional dysregulation one, which is the other thing, which may be that we have, again, disconnection building up to the point where there's a triggering of emotional dysregulation and impaired limits in it. So I think that's Yeah, and maybe bring
Yeah.
out an important new dimension to this. So the other interesting thing is how this is supported when we come from the opposite end of the spectrum and looking at positive schemas. And Jeff and Paul and I developed a healthy adaptive schema counterpoints to maladaptive schemas in that 2012 chapter. And then John Lewis and I and Alex Wood tested that out by putting those into inventory form factor and analyzing them, and then looking at to what degree they turned out as continua or not. And they kind of did, kind of didn't. But the important thing here in terms of the secondary structure is that we have a connection and acceptance domain, have healthy autonomy and performance, realistic standards and reciprocity, and proficiency and reasonable limits. So that maps quite well. There are interesting things that we discover about it. For example, with realistic standards, that it doesn't just, we thought that the limits, the impaired limits would show the empathic consideration with it, because there would be entitlement would be balanced by empathic consideration. But that's not where it showed up. It showed, what we found is that when people have more realistic expectations of themselves, they have more realistic expectations of others, and there's more give and take and flexibility in terms of their sense of self and other people. So that was a so the example, the kind of things that begin to show up when we look at how different primary schemas, in this case adaptive schemas, begin to cluster, and what it means about our understanding of the basic healthy processes that go on. And then success, that reasonable limits, we found that paired with healthy self-control, and one of the findings in terms of people who are successful is that they are conscientious and have high IQs. And so people who are able to be conscientious and plan things and follow through and are capable, that pairs with success then and doing well in life. So those are other things that are interesting in terms of how things are paired and what these different primary adaptive schemas mean. But the main thing I want to point out here is the consistency between the four major dimensions as it reinforces the four domain model. One of the, I think, the things that we look for within the secondary domains is, what does it tell us about needs and the major types of needs? And so we have a need for autonomy, for example, a need for connection, need for reasonable limits, and a need for realistic expectations of self. So that is good. But when we look at the domains, what does it tell us about the reparenting antidote and what our patients need? And I think that a lot of us operate on the assumption that we look at the schema and that points to what was missing in childhood and what we can do as a therapist to help counteract that. But when we look at the research, there's no one-to-one correspondence between a given dimension, given construct of the YPI and a schema. And that was when Jeff developed the YPI, that was the idea. He's looking for, it was sort of an obvious jump to him, is that, well, these are the things that parent needs to do, or the parents do, that lead to the schema. And it seemed relatively straightforward, but it did not hold up in the research. The other thing that we found, and this is a error here, that there are actually 6 negative patterns of parenting that have been identified and 7 positive patterns of parenting. So we have 6 patterns that when I developed, and John and then Chris pitched in on some of these item development phase of looking at everything that we could think of that a parent could do that could contribute to the development of a positive schema. And it boiled down to 7 patterns of in terms of positive things a parent could do. So that's another interesting thing, is that there's something going on between 18 schemas and 7 basic, or we have 14 adaptive schemas and 7 constructive things or healthy things that parents do to lead to development of schemas. So there's a more complex connection between what the need is and what the schema is. So go to the next slide. Okay.
I was just wondering, do we want to just before we go on to talk more about kind of like the needs and that, which is sort of like the next bit, wonder, do we want to give some people a chance to ask any questions at this stage, or do you want to?
Yeah, no, that sounds good. Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So does anyone have any questions or comments about material that was presented so far?
Okay.
All
Well,
right.
There's only one thing.
continue.
If I can quickly just say one thing, I was tempted to say it before, but I'll hold back. With the insufficient self-control schema, I've often found that seems to function differently for different people. That there might be a sort of more of an impaired limits, almost impulsive child type pathway, and the other one being more of a self-soothing pathway. So if that was the case, it would make sense that for some people that particular schema might group with the dysregulation. But for other people, if it's more coming down to impaired limits, not being able to say no to yourself, then it might sit with the four, with the third, what was it, the fourth impaired limits thing. So in other words, it might, depending on how you measure it, sit differently.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. I think I think that makes sense in terms of being like an addiction, the driven by the pain and someone who gets into that loop of being able to manage their pain through various acts of self-soothing, which is different from a primary, let's say with somebody who has ADHD, who is impulse control, and it's not around an addiction element or a self-soothing element, but just they have trouble with impulse control, right? So that,
Yes, yeah, or like an impulsive child type pathway. And you get a similar thing with anger, where people, it might be an expression of dysregulation rather than like an impaired limits thing. So there might be two distinct pathways or types of impulsivity and lack of self-control.
Right. We could say that impaired limits, let's say lack of limit setting. So you have the impulsive child. We have someone who is by nature more spontaneous and impulsive, and then someone who's more coping through self-soothing, and it gets into that route. So there's three kind of routes to that.
So I guess I noticed that, but also then I noticed you guys have found different results in your data depending on who you're looking at. With Chris looking at very disturbed people.
Yeah.
Slightly different items as well, but yes, it could be more a little more complex, like you're saying. That does make sense.
Right. Yeah. One of the things that just relating to who we look at, there's been quite consistent structure. That's one of the things that is emerging is between clinical and non-clinical samples that the same basic schemas show up. So that's an interesting thing. I think what Chris is bringing out is something that's new, and it could be that's a certain breakpoint beyond which, if you add more patients with higher level of dysfunction in terms of personality disorder, BPD, that it starts to break down in terms of there's something new that shows up. The other.
Right. Yeah, I just wanted to show then the next slide. I don't really want to talk about this, and really because of time, but what I'm going to do is just because there were a lot of Australian kind of like trainers here, just pointing out that we do have some good means and standard deviations now for the long form, which is in that Yeltsin article, and I'll send this at the end of the meeting. But what you can kind of like see is we have clinical means and standard deviations overall. They're the non-clinical population, and then within the clinical population, there's three groups of patients, one with PTSD only, one that were in a schema therapy program that had this more kind of like borderline presentation, really, and then a whole bunch of people in an alcohol and substance kind of like thing. So it's just if you want to use that as normative data, that will be kind of available. Don't need to sort of go.
That's great, Chris. Yeah, I get people asking about that all the time. So that'd be very useful.
All right. The next thing. So did want to say that remember a lot of the research though that we're talking about, I feel is a little limited because mostly when we've looked at what are the domains, we're relying on the YSQ. But as we teach people that are coming into schema therapy, you're not going to rely only on the YSQ as your formulation of what's happening in the case. You're going to, of course, be paying attention to the history, to what the presenting problems are, to kind of like imagery assessment and all of that. So I think an area of research that's neglected is like an interviewer-based schema assessment and seeing what the domains are. when we do that. That would be, for those of you that are interested in a research kind of a project, that would be cool, I think, to do.
That's great. That's really good, Chris. Yeah.
And now I'm just going to talk about, so I want to just compare short forms, long forms. I want to talk briefly about the rash kind of like versions with that. So the issues are this: the 232 item long form is very long, right? And so it led to people developing a short form. And the way that was developed was to pick the 5 highest correlating items. The problem when you do that is you lose a variance really in what's present in the sample. So if I give an example with depression, and then I'll give an example with abandonment. So let's say if you want a shorter form of depression, if you look at the Beck, right, for instance, and you take the 4 highest correlating items, you're going to get items that are in fact very similar, right, and load on depression. So you'll have an item like, I don't get satisfaction out of my usual activities. I don't get pleasure from my usual activities. So they'll be in the short form. But, you know, an item to do with suicidality will fall out because it's not highly endorsed and therefore won't correlate as well. But that's kind of a bit of a failing in that approach to short form. So we have a short form, we have a long form, and we're about to publish a rash form. And the rash form is 116 items. So it's a mathematical model to determine which of the long form items best discriminate between people with the schema and people who don't have the schema. Oops, sorry, just go back. And I've got this kind of like thing that's it's hard to get rid of. Can you read, can everyone else, hang on, I got it now. There we go. So it's kind of interesting. The best rash item to distinguish with abandonment from the long form is this one here. I feel addicted to partners who can't be there for me. So that item statistically differentiates the best between people who have abandonment and don't. It's kind of not in the short form. So it's sort of interesting. So according to Rash, this really does nail something about abandonment. Now, the next, I just want to show you our data when we look to analyze it. And we looked at the short form and the long form and the rash version in its association with psychopathology. And what you can see from this slide here is the short form does the worst, like 48% of the variance is accounted to it. The long form does better with nearly 50%, but the rash version with its 116 items gives you 4% more of the variance than the short form in explaining psychopathology. 4% is huge in terms of a variance, you know. That's like a difference between schema therapy and CBT, for example, in terms of effect size. So what we haven't done yet is do this outside of a PD population, which we're in the process of doing, and then we'll write that up. And if it does hold up in all of the other types of populations, that could be a new way forward. But my take home would be that for clinicians, I would encourage them to focus kind of like on the longer form and leave the shorter form for maybe for current research.
Yeah, it's really good, Chris. Yeah, that's really good. I think that it's also going to, if we look at the rash version and then do secondary structure on that, that's going to be interesting to take a look at. Well, I was going to say that when we were doing the Young Positive Schema questionnaire and looking at the items to pick on the all the different loadings, and remember going carefully through ones that were high loading, we wanted to shorten the form to come up with the best 4 items, and I was aware of how you could pick high loading ones that were saying basically the same thing, and we made an effort to try to get some spread on that, to take some items that would capture different aspects of the construct. So I mean, this is doing it in a more statistically sound way, so that's excellent. Yeah. So yeah, you want to that, Chris?
Yeah, what I sort of like to talk about this, I actually won't talk a lot about it, but just kind of like take home things for that. So what I want to, there's a group of us that are looking at developing a new schema mode inventory, so schema mode inventory 3, that will be based more on theory, about what we did was, if we're going to have new schema modes, rather than just everyone adding another mode that they think that they come across, we tried to go back to theory. Therefore, we went back to schemas and thought about what are the core schemas. And therefore, if you've got surrender and avoidance and counterattack against those, what the modes should look like. And then we ended up going back to needs because that underlines schemas. And in doing that, we were particularly attracted to Diak's 7 needs, which are put in there. And this slide just kind of like puts, here's the 5 kind of like needs that Young has talked about. And in the paper, which got published last week, what you could see is there's a lot of overlap between the two. But in showing this slide, I want to point out here, this self-coherence is one thing not accounted for in our current needs model, and is present in a lot of other theories. And it actually means that we are missing some schemas. So in our paper, what we've come up with is that we actually do have an idea of, we need a stable sense of self. So, you know, that saying that how comfortable does someone fit in their own skin, which is an interesting, kind of a bizarre thing to say, but it does exist cross-culturally. So there's a Dutch saying for it as well. So we need to experience ourselves as integrated, and we need the world to be meaningful. And when that goes wrong, you're going to get pathology like schizoid personality, for example, is a failure to have that kind of like sense of integration. And some of the chronic PTSD also talk about that failure to have that coherent sense of self. It's also present in borderline personality disorder. So I think it is true that we've kind of like missed that a cluster of possible schemas. So what we'll be testing out in the next year or so is to look for these schemas of coherent identity and meaningful world. And then the third research, not quite related to needs, but it's coming up again and again, is the concept of fairness. So in the, you know, in animal studies, it's very clear that that fairness. Maybe I did find that little clip. It's only 60 seconds. Maybe I should show that.
Well, yeah, I'll get you the longer TED Talk version of it, Chris. I was thinking about that.
Yeah, I just had to have a crack. Let's get it up because it's, hang on, where did it go? There we go.
It's the capuchins.
Yeah, it's a capuchins monkey thing. So what you're about to see is kind of like, these are 2 monkeys that live and socialize together, and they kind of like know each other, and they've been trained to take rocks out of their cage and give it to the experimenter, and they get a reward for that, a food reward, which is cucumbers. But the kind of like experimenter then changes it up, and that's what you're about to see. Can you see that now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Happens. So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. And that's what she does. And she gets a grape. And she eats it. The other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber. She tests the rock now against the wall. She needs to give it to us. And she gets cucumber again.
Okay. So just so that experiment's been replicated with dogs and other kind of like primates and that. So we do want equal pay, right, for the same amount of kind of like work. That's sort of like innately within us. So this concept of fairness really does seem, and you can think of. So whoops. Sorry, let me get rid of that.
These small, clever animals are kept in large enclosures.
Yeah, so it's kind of, you definitely see that, you know, with your clients, isn't it? You know, some of the ones that are ruminating about the injustices that is happening, kind of like PTSD, and it kind of like overtakes their lives. And there might be a you know, a genetic variance to the degree to which we're attracted to that kind of like fairness.
The question I had, Chris, is that I think to a certain degree, the mistrust abuse schema, let's say from the vantage point of that one capuchin monkey, if there was a child and it was his parent who was
Yeah,
giving him the cucumbers, he would say that he'd be cheated and deprived, and he would probably fill, or she would probably fill out the score high in the mistrust abuse schema. So that would be
you
picking
would
up
think
some of
so.
that.
Yeah, I would imagine. I mean, that's one of the reasons to test it. But I would imagine that it might correlate a little with a kind of like angry response. But I actually think it will be it'll stand out on its own. But we
The
can test it.
distinct, yeah, but that's interesting. Yeah, to see if if it's captured by that, or if it's a distinct notion in terms of fairness. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think the other thing I would say is in terms of the self and identity things, I know that Jeff had talked about early core needs because he had thought of like identity formation, things like that, particularly adolescence or later on, as sort of a later need. So I think that's something to think through in terms of what's early. Is that sort of grow out of early core needs being met, with a coherent sense of self, and that those basic things that'll flow from that, or is that something that's its own fundamental building block to
It should be its own fundamental building block according to the needs basis. So again,
yeah,
that would need to then test it, I think, in a model.
yeah, yeah,
And that's what it's about.
yeah. What I wanted to do to go to the next slide, because when you presented those, I was struck by the parallels between those needs with Dweck's model and then Jeff's model, which
So
doesn't
the
exactly.
7 core attachment needs. Did you want that slide?
Yeah, you go to that, and then there's
Yeah.
okay, so just beginning with a description of those, the emotional nurturance, unconditional love is one, playfulness and emotional openness, autonomy support, which is a parent seeing and believing in a child's capacity to succeed at important and challenging life goals, autonomy granting, the parent giving her child the freedom to be the central author of his or her life, dependability, being reliably present and dependable in providing guidance and support, intrinsic worth, providing guidance in the pursuit of intrinsically meaningful life goals combined with remaining true to oneself and fair and respectful to others. And number 7, confidence and competence, being and coming across as competent as parent. So these are the 5 dimensions that we emerged out of all the items we developed, assessing what good things parents do to develop early adaptive schemas. So we go to the next slide, Chris. So I looked at the correlation, and we have with Young's, I proposed 5 core emotional needs, Dweck's 7 needs, and these, what I propose as 7 core attachment needs. So safety and nurturance corresponds to emotional nurturance, and unconditional love corresponds to acceptance. So what's added here is the notion of unconditional love as being central to that. Play and spontaneity show up in Jeff's and my proposal, with the idea that play and spontaneity in my mind are same thing, and emotional openness is the thing that's important, that we find pairing with play as part of basic part of parenting. Autonomy, competence, identity, and that may get at the coherent sense of self. Autonomy support is what we see as helping to develop the child's capability, capacity to pursue goals and things important to them. And this goes with competence and Dweck's model. So those I see as overlapping quite well. Freedom to express needs, opinions, and emotions, and control in Dweck's model in terms of having a sense of agency. And this is clearly with autonomy granting, being the author of one's own life and being able to make your fundamental decisions and pursue your path. And so all those things match up closely in my mind. Realistic limits and self-control and predictability would go with Dweck's model. Dependability, I see what we find in the research we did is that realistic limits and self-control come by way of a parent who is dependable, consistent, shows up on time, honors promises, and models dependability and realistic control, and then helps to internalize realistic limits. But it's focused on the parent as being dependable. And then intrinsic worth is something that is not in Jeff's, and that goes with self-esteem and status in Dweck's model. And what we're focused on here is a parent who helps the child learn that they're worthwhile and everybody else is worthwhile, and there's a sense of reciprocity, and everybody has worth and merit, and things are pursued for their own sake. So that there's self-esteem status in the sense that status isn't pursued out of context of reciprocity and fairness. And then confidence, and competence is the other thing that showed up in ours in terms of parents who are capable, stable, or able to be successful in their own lives and provide a backdrop of consistency and stability through that. And then self-coherence is the thing that it's not directly accounted for in any of the models. So go to the next one.
Really interesting.
Huh?
I just got to raise the issue of time though now, George, because we did talk to people about making it an hour and enabling free to leave. There's a couple of minutes kind of like left with that. Did you want to make any kind of like closing comments? I mean, we're happy to hang around for another 10 minutes and talk about things that we haven't got to yet, but just to make sure that if people did need to leave, that you feel.
Yeah. Okay, well, maybe you slip the next slide, just glance over that core needs and attachment theory. This is the circle of, just glance at that. And then the next one, go ahead. This has to do with the secure base and autonomy. It covers those basic things. And then go to the next one. This captures a graphic of the 7 main secure attachment needs that I've talked about there in a graphic form. And come back if anybody wants to ask questions about that. Let me go to the final end. And then some future directions, which version of the YSQ to use. Chris talked about that already. New schemas to test. I think, what I want to focus here on is on scale refinement with emotional inhibition. We go to the next one. I think if that's significant, and that's something that is for example, bringing out what we would call an avoidant attachment, as far as a form of insecure attachment, that where there's a struggle between being close but protecting oneself, and then in order to refine our measure of that, what I propose is that we shift we modify the items on that schema to distinguish it from introversion. And so I'm too self-conscious to show positive feelings to others. For example, affection, showing our care, kind of including the people I'm closest to. So that addition for me is going to distinguish between someone who is introverted, who may say, yeah, I don't show positive feelings to others, but we don't know if in their intimate personal life that also holds up. If it does, I think that's going to highlight the avoidant attachment issue. And that's going to be more of a early maladaptive schema than it is a measure of introversion. So similarly, I find it embarrassing to express my feelings to others. A lot of introverted individuals will endorse that, but to say, including the people I am closest to, no, that they introverted individuals, they'll have 1 or 2 close others that they could do that with. If they don't, then that's the issue where emotional inhibition becomes more of a maladaptive schema. And I think that refinement will be important in terms of deepening our understanding of that, what's going on with that. So that's where I'll finish. And, Chris, any other final comments?
I think I covered the main things I wanted to say. Does anyone have any? If you need to go, that's fine. Thank you.
Yes, you can safely exit now. We can. But if anybody has questions, we can go back to any of those things. And,
a couple of questions, George. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
You mentioned in the new light on primary schemas that there's a new placement for subjugation. And where's the new placement for that? And I'm wondering whether that fits with the lack of coherent identity, that we're talking about now, where there's not.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, the new placement, it had been considered into the other directed domain, and where it shows up repeatedly is in the impaired autonomy. And so it seems to have more to do with a difficulty in being able to take a stand, being direct and clear because of not feeling competent or capable of handling day-to-day life. So it's like the idea of codependency and sort of deferring one's sense of self to others because you can't feel the ground under your own feet. And so that would certainly and go with that sense of
That's
not
an
having a
interesting
clear
idea.
identity.
Yeah, that in fact may, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I'm thinking particularly of a patient with DID who was repeatedly held down as a toddler if she became upset or expressed any feelings. And so it actually goes with terror if she doesn't subjugate herself and she can't have a sense of identity or a sense of cohesion. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, it's pretty extreme case that would, but that clearly, goes with then no sense of agency or self and being able to make choices and figure things out and have a sense of what she or he likes and doesn't like, because that's all crushed. And but what's interesting about that is that again, it would fall under impairment autonomy.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that comes out about it. So it's really about the sense of self rather than so much the power of others as it is the crushed self and being able to bring that out. Yeah.
My English is not so good, but I will try to ask a question regarding the last slide, emotional inhibition. I think about some patients who have no problem to be warm and spontaneous, or who don't feel inhibition in relationships, for example, with friends or colleagues. But when it comes to close relationships, those symptoms come up,
Right,
So
right.
there's just a problem with close relationships, but not with
Yeah,
lack
right.
close relationships.
Right, right. Yeah, and that would, yeah, it's interesting because I think we'd see the connection with others and the sense of belonging as being important and his own need being met there. But in terms of the connection and that primary domain around connection, so I think that it would fit in with the probably the items that I was suggesting maybe need to be tweaked a little bit, but I think but I'm focusing on when it comes to intimate personal relationships, what's going on around there. And that would highlight that. And that's where we'd have something that's significant around attachment, the basic sense of attachment, primary attachment figures in their life. Who's at home, who do they go to, who do they rely on when they're in need? And when it comes to the core sense of vulnerability, with these patients, something's missing there. And that would be connected with some intense affect and pain and be something then that we want to focus on clinically. But I think it wouldn't be showing up so clearly in our current inventory, current measure, current scale. Because that person that would highlight, they probably would have no emotional inhibition score on that scale. But if we added the correct revisions to them, they'd probably be endorsing some of those items. If they have to say, what I'm asking them in those items is that I can be expressive and spontaneous with people in general and with the people I'm closest to. It's a reverse, it's saying a reverse of that. Can you do that in all those areas? And if they can't, that if they're inhibited, to think about that, because it's asking, but it may have to revise the item, but that's the kind of case that we want to be able to capture. Is exactly that in terms of the emotional inhibition, the kind of emotional inhibition that would be particularly important to us. Kind of avoidant attachment.
Yeah, I think so. But I'm considered if it's so clear, if you have to answer this item, you know what I mean? So,
yeah, right. But we want to develop items for them. Yeah, if we can do the kind of item that they would endorse. But yes, I have a problem in that area. Yeah. But that, I suppose, how we would change that. Let me just say, can you bring up that slide, Chris? The last one.
Yep.
Because we could probably capture it by just a little tweak on those items, and that would cover that case.
Oops. Is that, sorry, no, that's not the one. This one.
Yeah.
That's the one, yeah.
Yeah, I'm too self-conscious to show positive feelings to the people I'm closest to. So leave out others, just to the people I'm closest to. I find it embarrassing to show my feelings to the people I'm closest to. So that would pick up on that case. We don't really care so much about general, but maybe we would have a separate scale for that. You know, emotional inhibition in the context of group functioning and emotional inhibition in the context of intimate relationships. But I think the intimate relationship part then again would pick up on the attachment theory related construct of avoidant attachment.
George, sorry, I just wanted to pick up again. The reason I raised terror is that I was thinking about whether the lack of cohesion is also related to safety as well as autonomy, the need for safety. Because what I've observed with clients is the more afraid they are, the less safe they feel, the more uncohesed they become.
Uh-huh.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
right.
Yeah.
I think you connected it with autonomy, and I'm sort of
Right. No, that's a good point. Yeah. I think that, well,
it would be either, wouldn't it, George? Like it would be like the more disconnected you feel, the more your anxiety would go up and the less coherence you would feel, but also autonomy as well.
yeah, no, it seems that's a severe case where it would be hitting on both. There's emotional deprivation. You know, it's not just a parent who's loving but squashing, you know, but it's a parent that's abuse, emotional abuse,
Yeah, emotional
as well
abuse
as
is
crushing.
Yes,
So it's
yes.
they're being, so it's really
Yeah.
hitting on both of those in quite an extreme way.
And this
Yeah.
was also a point when it comes to excessive responsibility and standards. When you said they're forced to should do the right thing, I think there's another thing. It's guilt within could be a topic. And also in this case, so that you feel the problems, you feel the inhibition, you feel the pain when it comes to close relationships and not in other cases.
Yeah, well, that's, I think that's a
My English is not
self-sacrifice.
so good, sorry.
Yeah,
Pardon?
but really, wouldn't it be self-sacrifice is picking up on the guilt function.
Yeah.
Standards is the perfectionism, and the self-sacrifice is the guilt, and and that's, so I think that's where that's coming in. So it's a does that make sense? I mean, that's where it,
I try to follow.
because that's falling within that domain, which is an over socialization. I like that term that Chris uses. And so there's that having high standards for how one is performing, and it's also having extreme expectations in terms of being there for others and a sense of responsibility for others' well-being.
And it may not be forced. You know, the other origin is strongly modeled.
Right.
So parents highly into doing the right thing like that, then the child kind of develops that from that, and then you'll see that really strong guilt with that.
Right.
So it has to do with emotional things when with close relationships, and then inhibition is coming up because of negative experience with the close mother, for example, who is very mother who is I'm sorry, my English.
Controlling and
not controlling. She's weak and needy, and I should make me strong, or I love you so much.
Right.
And you are responsible.
Like the parentified child, right? With the child is putting into the parent role to take care of the childlike parent. right?
Yeah.
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 Right.
Is it
Yeah.
still fair to say, though, even though it's excessive responsibility and socialization, it's not other-directedness, but there is still an element of having to regulate the other through self-sacrificing or high standards, seeking approval of others. So there's still this element of, whether it's a needy parent even, you know, a needy parent that's depressed perhaps, or you know, that there is this kind of regulation of the other in the environment in some capacity in order to have an attachment to the caregiver. So in some ways, I, you know, kind of think of it in terms of just language, in terms of understanding the experience of the individual. Would that be a fair?
Well, I think that with the shamed effectiveness, for example, there's a lot of other in terms of unconditional love and what do you say and don't say, and sort of positioning yourself or what you're going to present as a self to the other around that. So I think that there's self-other within that connection domain as well as self-other in terms of it, but that's more in terms of hurting someone rather than being rejected by someone, let's say.
Yeah.
So, but
Yeah.
they're both, the other is a big deal in either case, but what's the fallout is they're hurt or they're rejecting me.
Just a comment. I was wondering if you'd be happy to talk to the slide on attachment styles and schemas, if you have time.
Sure, yeah. You want to go to that, Chris?
Yeah. Is that, oh, hang on, I'll get it up to share.
Just while you're getting that, Chris, it's really interesting. My son had a little orientation today for his first day of school. And I was saying to the teacher, look, you know, he tends to kind of go, I'm bad at things, and, you know, without trying. And then the teacher said to me, oh, look, we do this positive growth mindset with Carol Dweck's theory. And this is how we actually help them. So I Googled it this morning, just kind of looking at her work, and then here we are talking about it.
Yeah, no, that's good. She's very good. Can you go up one, Chris? Yeah, just, well, I think it's down. We're going to get that one. Let me stop at that one right there. One up, one up.
One up.
Yeah, I just want to say that in terms of the idea of 7 core attachment needs, to the left, there's connection. To the right, there's autonomy. Autonomy granting is exploration, dependability, playfulness, emotional openness. One of the things that I wanted to highlight in the graph is that secure attachment isn't just about connection on the left side. It's equally about supporting autonomy, because if the child feels connected but not supported in terms of autonomy, their sense of secure attachment gets diminished. And so it's all of these things feeding into a secure attachment. So if we go to the next one, then let's see, attachment styles. I was looking at, just glancing at these broad brushstrokes again in terms of adult attachment styles, because those shift, the childhood attachment styles shift, morph a bit to adult attachment styles. We have fearful, avoidant, and I think that a lot of the patients we would be seeing would be fearful, avoidant, or anxious, preoccupied, and some blending of those two, actually. It's not that we always fall into one category, but the fearful, avoidant involves those main schemas around the connection domain along with emotional inhibition. And so that the avoidant coping comes into that. And then the anxious, preoccupied I see as those same kinds of schemas along with a compensatory coping. So clinging, sort of trying to manage what's going on in the relationship and getting strident. So it's just different elements of coping being blended in with the same kind of pain around disconnect. And then the dismissive avoidant form, I think, is more like the not emotionally reactive and as sensitive, maybe having been abused and emotionally deprived, but developing more of a sense of entitlement and more the narcissistic compensatory reaction to those early early sources of pain. So that's my sort of quick take on where we are in relation to schemas when it comes to adult coping styles. And so do you have any questions about that?
I just, sorry, my microphone wasn't working. I just had more of a comment really earlier on. Again, I think Rita, you were sort of mentioning this. It's really interesting that the other directedness hasn't fallen out as an empirical concept at all, just because of how relevant it is clinically and fundamentally useful as a clinical concept. So it's kind of interesting, but then I suppose what you're saying is a reason for that is because each of those schemas originally in that domain are, we know that they're compensatory or they're coping schemas to cope with the disconnection. So they're probably each related to different schemas in the disconnection domain. Such a beautiful construct clinically.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. I think other directedness is I like that, and I think that I think that then the question is, I think it's just not it's not a fundamental concept. It's a clinically relevant one, and it captures things, but it's not in terms of the other directedness. Is it about guilt? Is it about shame? Is it about needing someone because you don't feel capable? So I think that there's sort of what's driving the other directedness would point us to more of the core constructs. So
yes, no, I agree. It's just when I'm working with sort of treatment-resistant depression, chronic depression clients, I'll often get with each of those individuals strong correlations between the individual schemas, clinically. They'll also have evidence to say that they're very self-sacrificing, and they're also very subjugated, and there also might be quite approval-seeking. So for me, when I describe that to my clients and I give them that other directedness term, but we explore where did that come from, they find that quite revolutionary. So it's interesting that to them it's a really interesting concept.
Right.
I just had one other question for Chris. Just when you're looking at the clinical samples and you look at punitiveness, say in depression samples, do you find that is always a trait, or is that state dependent? Because sometimes I look at my depressed clients and I'm interested. Some are very high on punitiveness, and I often say, well, I don't take too much. I won't take that for granted.
Yeah. So I reckon I don't know the answer to that, and I've thought about it quite a bit, I've got to say, and we don't really have the data. And the way to have the data, of course, is to have a look at a chronic depressed sample and follow them up over time and see whether the punitiveness stays up over that period. I mean, it's such a central core construct, but whether it's functioning more like a punitive mode in that chronic depressed client or its inherent trait kind of thing, I'm not sure. And I would like to test it. I mean, it's so central to the treatment, but I still would like to know how does it more kind of like function.
True, thank you.
So one of the things, just another thing related to attachment styles, that if we're looking at the adult attachment styles, one of the things I think would be missing in that, because they're talking about fearful, preoccupied, fearful, avoidant, or dismissive. If we're looking at autonomy, impaired autonomy, I think another attachment style would have to do with something around enmeshment or codependency, but we're not really getting that. And I think that would be another adult attachment style, would be something where there would be a shutdown of autonomous functioning, not just problems around the connection domain. And that's what all of them are pointed at. So I think that would be something that we could propose as far as an attachment model to flesh that out a bit.
Have you considered, because you and Chris, you have access to these large data sets, I don't know much about this analysis, but have you considered doing something like latent profile analysis? Because the factor analyses are telling us how variables are clustering or clinging together. But what I think would be really interesting is to look at how a schema's clustering at the person level. So if someone has a subjugation schema and a self-sacrifice schema, and like whether there's clusters in that sense.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that's. I think that Marlene had talked about that, about from her studies, thinking that the profile was there's some statistics she was looking at that highlighted that relevance. But I think that that's a great idea. Yeah. So that's, Chris, you think that in terms of looking at some of the, I mean, you could think about that statistically in terms of
Yeah, no, I'll start that next week.
Yeah, good. Yeah.
Get onto
it. Look at the MMPI.
I think it's a great idea. It's just, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, all the mileage the MMPI gets out of profile analysis. So I think that would be, I mean, we'd have the different domains, we could break it down, and there'd be a lot of things to.
Yeah, and it would be quite interesting to look at what those clusters then predict in terms of predicting psychopathology, predicting depression over time. Yeah, there's so many things you could do with that.
Yeah, it makes it more dynamic in that way in terms of how those things interact. And yeah. Well,
good. Are we done?
I think I'm aware of the time. I'm just wondering, I guess some take-home messages. Maybe we could just, 2 or 3 summary take-home messages, because we are recording it as a webinar, and hoping that we can allow other members to watch this at some point as well. Sorry, I have a 5-year-old talking to me, so I will.
Yeah. Chris, do you want to start? Do you want me to do that?
I think thinking about going back to the beginning with George, where you're talking about kind of like understanding case conceptualization, thinking about in terms of those kind of like domains really makes a lot of sense, right? And treating that as a broad brush kind of like approach to conceptualizing it, and kind of like using the domains that really do seem to stand the test of time and hold up makes a lot of sense. The second kind of like point, I guess, that I'd be interested in is that I think it would be better if we used not the short form in the future when we're looking at things. Either a rash form or a long form would be really important to do, because I think we're missing some things along the way. There needs to be I think some George's kind of like slide I really like of the different kind of like needs ideas, like comparing the model that you come up with, the Dyack thing and the Young thing. I think that's a really interesting area for future research. So I guess they're the things that most hit me.
Yeah. Okay. Just to add to that, I think that the connection between schemas, the 18 schemas, and needs is hello there, is not what we believed it to be. And I think that if we want to really understand needs, one place to look is what Chris was alluding to, is the terms of what those core needs based on what parents do. And if we think of a need as being connected with a nutriment of some sort, if a parent's not providing it, then is the need there in terms of early core needs. So I think if we look at the 7 patterns, which corresponds closely with the other things, I think that we can have a reference point, important reference point, and also that scale that we developed in terms of the positive parenting patterns can be used as for you as a clinician. Give it to your patient and see what they think about, because it all has to do with interactions between someone in a parental kind of role. So so that would be one thing in terms of a look at needs in terms of our functioning as limited parents and how to make sense of that. And I think that these and I think that the broader brushstrokes of domains, I think, helps to organize and make sense of and help hang on to what we're seeing in terms of all the complex unfolding within a case. And I think that these other ideas, new cutting edges things, would be emotional inhibition. That's a key thing. That's a surprising jump in terms of the domain to the connect some other domain, the inhibition domain to the connection domain. What's going on there, and can we refine that? And is that really what we're talking about in terms of avoidant attachment? If it is, that adds to the attachment theory work, and will be some important things we can add. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Cool. Right, thanks everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day, or go to bed. Those people are up at 2 a.m. You know, and have a good night's sleep.
Yeah. Thank you,
Thank
Rita,
you so much.
for initiating this, and thank you, Chris. This has really been fun to work with you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you
Bye.
very much.